I'm Matthew.
I'm Mike.
Welcome back to Keep Liberty Alive.
When we left George Washington, he was reading the Declaration of Independence to his troops in New York.
At the end of the reading, there was much fanfare and cheering, but there was still a long way to go to gain independence.
This is Part 4, Episode 2, Perseverance.
After the reading of the Declaration of Independence on July 9th, a mob tore down a statue of King George III.
They cut off the statue's head, mounted it on a spike outside a tavern, and melted down the rest of the statue into musket balls.
The British sailed into the Hudson River on July 12th.
They attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Americans, but surrender was not on the menu.
On August 1st, 45 more British ships arrived, along with thousands of Hessian soldiers.
The Hessian soldiers were German mercenaries hired to help the British in their fight against the Americans.
The British had assembled a massive force to fight the Americans at New York, a force that the Americans ultimately could not repel.
Washington had split his forces, and his generals weren't experienced enough to go toe-to-toe with the British.
After being overwhelmed in the Battle of Brooklyn, it was decided that they would retreat in the night across the East River to the Isle of Manhattan.
All troops evacuated to Manhattan by August 30th, and though the Americans had lost that battle, they hadn't lost a lot of troops.
The Americans were then forced to retreat north, where they intended to put up a stand, but the British were still too much for them.
On November 16th, the British captured Fort Washington without much of a fight.
On November 20th, the Americans abandoned Fort Lee and retreated south to New Jersey, reaching Trenton on December 2nd.
There, they rounded up every boat they could, destroyed boats they did not need, and Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania.
When the British reached Trenton, they found it deserted and Washington's army gone.
On December 13th, one of Washington's generals, General Charles Lee, was captured by the British.
General Lee had been a thorn in Washington's side, his capture ultimately being a good thing.
The weather had turned cold, and the British decided to suspend military activity for the winter, which was fairly common.
So, General Howe and his British troops left for New York on December 14th, having made New York City his military base, which they held until November of 1783, after leaving behind 1,500 Hessian soldiers to defend Trenton, of which Washington was unaware.
At this point, Washington needed something to go his way.
All of his troop enlistments were due to expire on January 1st, and he only had about 6,000 troops fit for duty.
He needed to do something, and he needed to do it quickly.
So he and his advisors came up with a surprise attack on Trenton on the night of December 25th.
They were to cross the Delaware River in 3 locations and attack Trenton on multiple sides.
Before midnight, Washington's army began crossing the Delaware River at a place called McConkey's Ferry.
2 other groups were to cross as well, one at Bristol and one across from Trenton.
But a strong, very cold nor'easter blew in and made the crossing treacherous.
The storm was so strong and there was so much ice in the river that the other 2 parts of the army called off the attack.
However, Washington, not knowing that the others had fallen back, braved the storm and the ice and made the crossing.
After crossing, the troops marched south silently in absolutely freezing conditions.
It was so cold that 2 men reportedly froze to death along the way.
The army split into 2 columns in order to approach Trenton from 2 different sides.
They basically caught the Hessian soldiers unaware.
The troops found that many of their guns were too wet to fire, so Washington ordered them to use bayonets.
They attacked just before 8 a.m. in the middle of what was described as a violent storm.
The Continental soldiers used cannons to clear the streets of Hessians and fought hand to hand with bayonets.
After a battle that lasted approximately 45 minutes, the Hessians found themselves surrounded and defeated, and they surrendered.
Miraculously, no Americans were killed in the battle.
The only deaths were the 2 soldiers that froze to death along the way.
After defeating the Hessians at Trenton, Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware back to Pennsylvania.
Washington, still faced with soldiers' enlistments set to expire on January 1st, knew he needed at least another victory for the colonial army.
So he crossed the Delaware back to New Jersey and set his troops on a ridge above Trenton to wait for the British.
General Cornwallis and his British army reached Princeton on January 1st.
On January 2nd, he left part of his army at Princeton and took the rest to Trenton.
The Americans fought to hold the British back, but they couldn't stand up to the British troops and had to fall back to Trenton.
When Cornwallis reached Trenton, he decided to wait until morning to attack Washington's army.
In the morning, they found that Washington and his army had gone, assuming that they had retreated, as they had done many times before.
However, in the middle of the night, Washington and his army had looped around to the north to come in from behind the British army at Princeton.
On January 3rd, at sunrise, they launched a surprise attack against Cornwallis's rear guard.
After a fierce battle, some of the British troops were taken prisoner, and the rest fled toward Trenton.
With these 2 victories, which were actually very small victories, but huge victories when it came to troop morale, the Americans had turned the tide of war for the moment.
This ended the campaign of 1776 on a high note and led to more troop enlistments in the spring and much encouragement in and from Congress.
In the next episode, we will hit the highlights of the battles of the next 3 years to follow Washington and his army on the quest for independence.